March 1936. Southampton, England. A sick man stands on an airfield, watching a fighter plane take off for the first time, a plane he designed, a plane that will one day be called the greatest fighter of the Second World War. He will not live to see it fire a single shot in anger. His philosophy was simple: strip away every ounce of drag physics would allow. That obsession would build the most famous wing shape in aviation history, and very nearly get his creation cancelled before it ever reached a squadron. How does a machine save a nation 2 years after the man who built it is already dead? His name was Reginald Joseph Mitchell. This is the story of the wing that beat the Luftwaffe, and the man who never got to see it fight. Reginald Mitchell was born in 1895 in the pottery town of Stoke-on-Trent, the son of a schoolmaster. There was no aviation dynasty behind him, no family name in engineering. At 16, he left school and apprenticed at a locomotive works, learning to draft in an industry built on steel, steam, and tolerances measured by hand. Night classes at a local technical college filled in what the workshop floor couldn't teach him. He was not the product of Oxford or Cambridge. He was the product of grease, gear ratios, and a stubborn refusal to stop asking why a machine worked the way it did. In 1916, at 21 years old, he walked into the Supermarine Aviation Works in Southampton as a draftsman. Within a single year, the company promoted him to chief designer. It was an almost reckless bet on an untested young man, and it paid off faster than anyone expected. Supermarine built flying boats and racing seaplanes, and it was here, in the 1920s, that Mitchell found the obsession that would define the rest of his life. Britain had entered the Schneider Trophy, the era's most prestigious air race, a brutal contest where national pride and raw speed collided over open water. Mitchell didn't just want to win it. He wanted to understand, down to the rivet, why one shape moved through air faster than another. Between 1922 and 1931, he designed a string of supermarine racing seaplanes, each one faster and more refined than the last. Every surface was interrogated. Every strut, every seam, every square inch of metal that touched the airstream was a candidate for removal. In 1931, his Supermarine S6B didn't just win the Schneider Trophy, it won it outright, claiming the trophy permanently for Britain and setting a world airspeed record in the same year. It was the culmination of a decade spent chasing a single idea. That speed wasn't something you added to an aircraft. It was something you found by taking everything else away. That idea had a name, even if Mitchell rarely spoke it aloud. Drag was the enemy, not the engine's limits, not the pilot's skill, but the invisible resistance of air itself. And the purest way to defeat it was mathematical. A wing shaped like an ellipse, tapering smoothly from root to tip, produced less induced drag than almost any other planform physics allowed. It was not a new theory. But building one, shaping metal into a true continuous curve, rib after rib, each one slightly different from the last, was another matter entirely. Most engineers who understood the elliptical wing's advantage also understood why almost no one dared build one for mass production. It was beautiful. It was brutally difficult to manufacture. Mitchell decided he would build it anyway. He carried that philosophy forward from the racing seaplanes into something built to fight, not race. Subtract until physics says stop. It would give his next aircraft a shape unlike anything in the sky, and a production nightmare that would nearly cost Britain the very fighter it needed most. In 1931, the Air Ministry issued Specification F730, calling for a new single-seat fighter to replace Britain's aging biplanes. Mitchell answered with the Type 224, a gull-winged monoplane fighter with a fixed undercarriage and an engine cooling system that never worked as intended. It first flew in February 1934, and it was, by any honest measure, a disappointment. It was slow. It struggled to meet the ministry's own performance targets. The Air Ministry's enthusiasm cooled almost as fast as the aircraft's troubled engine. For Mitchell, a man who had just spent a decade winning the fastest race in the world, the Type 224's failure was not a footnote. It was a warning that raw ambition alone would not be enough. Across the North Sea, a very different philosophy was already taking shape. In Germany, the Reich Air Ministry, the RLM, was preparing its own fighter competition, and one of the men chasing that contract was a Bavarian engineer named Willy Messerschmitt. Where Mitchell had spent the 1920s obsessed with drag reduction on racing seaplanes, Messerschmitt had built his reputation on something almost the opposite: simplicity. His designs favored a compact, tapered wing, straightforward construction, and, above all, a structure that could be built fast, in volume, by a workforce that didn't need to be master craftsmen. Mitchell wanted to remove everything drag would allow. Messerschmitt wanted to remove everything time would allow. Two engineers, two nations, two philosophies about to be tested in the same war. Mitchell did not walk away from the Type 224's failure. He tore the design apart and started again. The new aircraft, designated the Type 300, kept almost nothing of its predecessor. Gone was the fixed undercarriage. Gone was the gull wing. In its place came a retractable landing gear, a fully enclosed cockpit, and a wing shape Mitchell had been circling back to since his racing days. A thin, elegant ellipse, engineered to carry enough fuel and firepower while keeping drag as close to theoretical zero as 1930s engineering allowed. The Air Ministry, still smarting from the Type 224, was cautious, but the specification kept evolving, and so did Mitchell's design, until the two converged into something neither the Ministry nor Mitchell had quite pictured at the start. On March 5, 1936, the prototype, serial number K5054, rolled out onto the airfield at Eastleigh. Chief Test Pilot Joseph "Mutt" Summers took it up for its maiden flight. It lasted only a matter of minutes, a short, careful circuit to confirm the aircraft was airworthy. But what those minutes revealed was unmistakable. The aircraft was fast, stable, and startlingly responsive, a fighter that seemed to answer the pilot's hands before he'd finished the thought. Summers landed, climbed out, and reportedly told the ground crew not to touch a thing. It was, in his judgment, already right. Word moved quickly. The Air Ministry, watching a design finally deliver on everything the Type 224 had promised and failed to provide, moved with unusual speed of its own. Before full production trials had even concluded, before the bugs of a brand new airframe had been fully worked out, the Ministry placed an order for 310 aircraft. It was an extraordinary act of confidence in an unproven design, and it would soon collide with a problem no one on that airfield in March 1936 could yet see coming. The aircraft needed a name. Supermarine settled on Spitfire, a name Mitchell reportedly disliked, considering it a bloody silly name for a machine he saw as a serious instrument of engineering, not a swaggering nickname. His objection didn't matter. The name stuck, and within it rode the promise of everything Mitchell had chased since his Schneider Trophy days, a fighter shaped by subtraction, built to outturn and outclimb anything Germany could put in the air against it. 400 miles away, Messerschmitt's own fighter was closing in on its own competition win. The RLM's fly-off would settle which German design would arm the Luftwaffe, and Messerschmitt's entry, compact, tapered, easy to mass-produce, was proving just as capable of winning a contract as Mitchell's elegant ellipse had been. Two design philosophies born from two different national instincts about what a fighter needed to be had each just cleared their first hurdle. One was built to be beautiful in the air. The other was built to be everywhere in the air, in overwhelming numbers. Neither Mitchell nor Messerschmitt yet knew how directly those two choices would be tested against each other, or how soon. By the end of 1936, Britain had its fighter on paper and its order placed. What it did not yet have was a way to actually build 310 of them fast enough to matter. On August 4, 1938, the first production Spitfires arrived at RAF Duxford, issued to No. 19 Squadron. The men who climbed into those cockpits were stepping into something genuinely new, a fighter faster and more responsive than anything the RAF had flown before, still trailing the growing pains of a production line that had taken nearly 2 years longer than promised to deliver it. Pilots learned the aircraft's quirks in real time. The narrow undercarriage that demanded a careful hand on takeoff and landing, the retractable gear that some pilots, in the heat of early training, forgot to lower before touching down. But they also learned what the elliptical wing had bought them, a turn radius and a rate of climb that made the Spitfire feel less like a machine and more like an extension of the pilot's own instincts. Through late 1938 and into 1939, more squadrons converted. Number 602 and number 603 squadrons, both Scottish auxiliary units, took up Spitfires as the shadow of war lengthened across Europe. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939 and Britain declared war, the Spitfire had been in RAF service barely 13 months. It was untested in combat, flown by pilots who had trained on it for months rather than years, built by a manufacturing effort still finding its footing. The wait for a true test did not last long. On October 16, 1939, the Luftwaffe launched an air raid against Royal Navy warships anchored in the Firth of Forth, the first attack on the British mainland since the First World War. Spitfires of 602 and 603 squadrons scrambled to intercept. In the running fight that followed, Scottish-based Spitfire pilots shot down two Heinkel He-111 bombers into the waters of the Forth. It was a small engagement by the standards of what was coming, but its significance was not small at all. It was the first time Mitchell's fighter had drawn German blood, and it did so nearly 2 years after his own funeral, proof, on a cold October afternoon over Scottish waters, that the design he never lived to see in combat could do exactly what he'd built it to do. For the winter that followed, the war on the Western Front settled into what the newspapers called the phony war, a strange lull of mobilization without major combat. Spitfire squadrons used the pause to refine tactics, train new pilots, and push production numbers upward, even as the looming German offensive in the West made clear that the lull would not last. By the spring of 1940, when the Wehrmacht tore through the Low Countries and France in a matter of weeks, RAF Fighter Command found itself with a fighter that had proven itself capable in a skirmish, but was about to be tested in something far larger than anyone in 1936 had imagined. The true trial came in the summer of 1940. With France fallen and the Luftwaffe massing across the Channel, Germany turned its air power toward a single objective: destroy RAF Fighter Command and clear the skies for invasion. What followed became known as the Battle of Britain, and it was the moment the Spitfire's design philosophy met its German counterpart in direct sustained combat for the first time. The two fighters were closely matched on paper. The Spitfire Mark I and the Messerschmitt Bf 109E both reached speeds near 360 miles per hour at their best operating altitudes, and both carried enough firepower to bring down a bomber or a fighter in a well-aimed burst. But the numbers on a spec sheet told only part of the story. In the tight, turning dogfights that defined the battle, the Spitfire's elliptical wing gave it a tighter turn radius and a gentler, more forgiving stall than the Bf 109, the very trait Mitchell had chased since his Schneider Trophy days, now translating directly into a pilot's ability to outturn an attacker and live to fight another day. British pilots and squadron commanders built their tactics around exactly that strength, favoring turning engagements that played to the Spitfire's advantage, while Hurricanes, sturdier, slower, but heavily armed, were often directed toward the bomber formations, leaving Spitfires to engage the escorting Bf 109s directly. The Bf 109, for its part, held its own advantages: a faster dive and, thanks to its fuel-injected engine, the ability to push into a negative G dive without the brief engine stutter that plagued the Spitfire's carburetor-fed Merlin. German pilots learned to use that dive to disengage from turning fights they were losing, denying Spitfire pilots the kill even when they had the positional advantage. It was a battle fought as much between two design philosophies as between two air forces: subtraction of drag against subtraction of manufacturing time, tested thousands of feet over the English Channel and the fields of southern England. Through the summer and into September 1940, RAF Fighter Command held the line. Squadron after squadron scrambled multiple times a day, pilots flying until exhaustion blurred the difference between missions. Spitfire pilots claimed victories against German fighters and bombers alike, and, as with most air combat of the era, claimed kill totals on both sides ran well ahead of confirmed losses, a discrepancy later historians have had to reconcile against wreckage records and unit logs on both sides of the Channel. What is not in dispute is the outcome. By the end of September 1940, the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority. Hitler postponed the invasion of Britain indefinitely, and the Spitfire, flying its first sustained campaign barely 2 years after entering service, had helped ensure that failure. Production, meanwhile, was climbing to meet the demand the battle had created. But the same elliptical wing that gave pilots their edge in the turn was, on the factory floor, becoming a very different kind of problem, one that had already nearly derailed the program before a single Spitfire ever reached a squadron. The same wing that let Spitfire pilots out, turn their attackers over southern England was, back on the factory floor, a nightmare no one at Supermarine had fully reckoned with. An elliptical wing is not a shape a machine stamps out in one motion. Every rib along its length is a slightly different size and curve from the one beside it, tapering continuously from root to tip. Building one meant hand-fitting hundreds of uniquely shaped components with tolerances far tighter than British aircraft manufacturing was accustomed to holding. Estimates from the period suggest a Spitfire took roughly 3 times as many man-hours to build as a Messerschmitt Bf 109, a gap rooted directly in the wing Mitchell had spent a decade perfecting. Supermarine, a company built on small-batch racing seaplanes, had no experience running a modern mass production line. Drawings and specifications had to be distributed to a scattered network of subcontractors across the country, each one learning to reproduce Mitchell's exacting curves for the first time. Delays compounded delays. The fine tolerances the design demanded led to quality problems on early batches. What had been ordered in 1936 as 310 aircraft, delivered with confidence before production trials even finished, became a program so far behind schedule that the Air Ministry seriously considered canceling the order outright. The same philosophy that would make the Spitfire deadly in a dogfight was, in 1937 and 1938, threatening to keep it out of the fight entirely. Across the channel, Messerschmitt's Bf 109 told the opposite story. Its tapered, straight-edged wing could be stamped and assembled with far less specialized labor, and the Reich Air Ministry moved it into full-scale production with comparatively little friction. As German rearmament accelerated through the late 1930s, Bf 109s rolled off assembly lines at a pace Supermarines' dispersed, hand-fitted process simply could not match. It was not that German engineers had discovered some secret Mitchell had missed. It was that Messerschmitt had built his fighter around a different question entirely. Not how do I make this as efficient in the air as physics allows, but how do I make this as fast as possible to put in the air, in numbers, when the war actually starts. By the time Mitchell died in June 1937, that gap had already become the program's central danger. His successor, Joseph Smith, inherited not just an unfinished aircraft, but an unfinished factory system. One that would need to be rebuilt into something resembling true mass production before the design underneath it could matter to anyone. The political pressure compounded the technical one. Every month of delay was a month the Air Ministry had to explain to a government increasingly anxious about German air strength. Officials who had gambled political capital on ordering 310 unproven aircraft now faced the possibility of defending a program that couldn't deliver even a fraction of that number on schedule. There was serious internal debate about whether Supermarine's approach could be salvaged at all, or whether Britain would need to fall back on simpler, faster-to-build fighters instead. A debate that, had it gone the other way, might have kept the Spitfire out of RAF service before the war it was built for had even begun. What ultimately saved the program was not a change in Mitchell's design, but a change in how Britain built it. Production was progressively dispersed across a wider network of subcontractors and later, shadow factories, a system that added its own logistical complexity but also meant no single German bombing raid could knock out Spitfire production in one strike. It was a slow, difficult fix, bought with the same tolerance for hand-built complexity that had caused the problem in the first place. By the summer of 1940, output had finally climbed to a pace that could sustain the losses of sustained combat, but only just, and only after nearly 3 years in which the aircraft's own defining virtue had come closer to grounding it than any enemy ever had. Even as the production crisis eased, the enemy on the other side of the channel had not stood still. The Bf 109E variant flying in the Battle of Britain was a faster-producing, continuously improving design, backed by a manufacturing system built from the start for volume. The very trait that let Mitchell's fighter win in the turn, the costly, hand-shaped ellipse, was the same trait that had let Germany's simpler fighter win the race to fill the sky first. Britain had closed the production gap just in time. It would not have taken much less margin for the story to have ended very differently. By early 1937, Reginald Mitchell had been living with cancer for 4 years. He had first undergone surgery for rectal cancer back in 1933, and for a time it seemed the disease had been beaten back. He returned to work with the same intensity that had defined his entire career, earning his private pilot's license in 1934. A 51-year-old chief designer determined to understand his own aircraft not just from a drafting table, but from the cockpit. He watched his Type 300 evolve into the Spitfire. He watched the prototype fly. For a few years, it seemed as though he might see the whole story through to its end. Then, in early 1937, the cancer returned. This time there was no reprieve. Doctors at a specialist clinic gave him a blunt prognosis, perhaps 3 months left to live. Most men, told that, would have stopped working. Mitchell did not. Colleagues who saw him in those final months described a man who kept a drawing board within reach even as his strength failed him, who kept asking after production numbers and structural revisions from what should have been a sickbed. He was, by every account, aware of exactly how little time remained, and he seemed determined to spend what was left of it exactly as he had spent the previous 20 years, bent over the next problem. In April 1937, in a last effort at treatment, Mitchell traveled to Vienna, to a clinic known as the American Foundation, hoping that continental medicine might offer what British doctors could not. It didn't. Within weeks, he understood the trip had been futile, and in May 1937, he returned home to Southampton, not to recover, but to die in familiar surroundings, among the company and the workshop that had defined his entire adult life. The final weeks played out quietly. There was no dramatic last flight, no cinematic farewell to the aircraft that would carry his name into history. Instead, there was a sick room, a family, and the slow, grinding progress of a disease that had already taken more from him than most men are asked to give. On June 11, 1937, Reginald Joseph Mitchell died in Southampton. He was 42 years old. He left behind a fighter that had flown exactly once in front of the public eye that mattered most to him, that brief, celebrated test flight at Eastleigh 14 months earlier, and an order for 310 aircraft that at the moment of his death, Supermarine had barely begun to fulfill. He would never see a Spitfire wear RAF colors. He would never see it climb to intercept a German bomber. He would never know whether the philosophy he had spent his entire career refining, strip away everything drag would allow, would be enough to matter when the war actually came. Command of the program passed to Joseph Smith, Mitchell's longtime collaborator and the man who understood the Spitfire's design almost as intimately as Mitchell himself. It was Smith, not Mitchell, who would spend the next year fighting to turn a brilliant but desperately slow-to-build prototype into a fighter force capable of meeting Germany in the air. It was Smith who inherited the production crisis, the subcontractor delays, and the very real possibility that the Air Ministry might cancel the order his predecessor had died still trying to fulfill. At Supermarine, the mood in the weeks after Mitchell's death was less one of a mourning ceremony than of quiet, urgent continuation. Mitchell himself had insisted, even before his death, that credit for the Spitfire belonged to his team as much as to him. He had asked that his colleagues be given precedence at his own funeral, a final instruction that said as much about the man as anything he ever drew on a board. There was no time, in the summer of 1937, for the company to stop and grieve properly. There was a fighter that still didn't fly fast enough off the assembly line, an Air Ministry losing patience, and a continent sliding toward war on a timeline no one at Supermarine controlled. 14 months after Mitchell's funeral, the first production Spitfire would finally reach an RAF squadron. 28 months after his funeral, it would fire its first shots in anger over the Firth of Forth. Mitchell would be present for none of it. Not the delivery, not the first kill, not the summer of 1940 when his fighter would help decide whether Britain remained free. He had built the machine. He would never know if it worked. Joseph Smith took over a program that was, in the summer of 1937, still closer to failure than to legend. The 310 Spitfires ordered a year earlier existed mostly on paper. Subcontractors across the country were still learning to reproduce Mitchell's elliptical ribs to the tolerances the design demanded, and every month of delay renewed the same question inside the Air Ministry. Was this aircraft, however brilliant in the air, simply too difficult to build in time to matter? Smith did not have the luxury of Mitchell's decade of unhurried experimentation. He had a design he had helped create, a production system that was failing, and a deadline set not by Supermarine, but by the pace of German rearmament across the Channel. Over the next year, Smith drove the production problem the only way it could be solved. Not by simplifying Mitchell's wing, which would have meant sacrificing the very performance the Air Ministry had ordered the aircraft for, but by rebuilding how Britain manufactured it. Work was spread wider across subcontractors. Processes were refined batch by batch, workers trained specifically on the ellipse's exacting curves. It was slow, unglamorous, and utterly essential. By August 1938, the first production Spitfires finally reached number 19 Squadron at Duxford, 14 months after the man who designed them had been buried. For the pilots who first flew those aircraft, Mitchell was already a name on a specification sheet, not a person they had met. A representative figure of that first generation was a young Scottish airman with 602 Squadron, one of the auxiliary units that would find itself scrambling to intercept German bombers over the Firth of Forth just over a year later, in October 1939. These were for the most part reservists and weekend flyers before the war. Solicitors, students, and shopkeepers who had joined an auxiliary squadron for the flying and found themselves, within months, in single combat over their own coastline. When 602 and 603 squadron pilots brought down two Heinkel bombers that October afternoon, they did so in an aircraft whose designer had never lived to see it fire a shot, flown by men who, a year before, had never expected to fire one themselves. The third outcome belonged to the company and its workforce. Supermarine, absorbed into the larger Vickers-Armstrongs group nearly a decade earlier, in 1928, had spent the years after Mitchell's death transforming itself from a boutique seaplane manufacturer into something closer to a wartime industrial machine. Thousands of workers across Britain, riveters, machinists, the women who would increasingly fill factory floors as the war drew more men into uniform, learned to build an aircraft whose creator was gone, working from drawings and specifications he had left behind rather than instructions he could still give. When German bombing later targeted the Supermarine works at Woolston, near Southampton, in September 1940, production had to be dispersed even further, scattered into smaller sites across the region precisely because Smith's earlier decision to widen the subcontractor network had already proven the model could work under pressure. By the time the Battle of Britain reached its peak in the late summer of 1940, the aircraft that emerged from that dispersed, hard-won production system bore only a distant resemblance to the fragile, delay-ridden program Smith had inherited 3 years earlier. It flew, it fought, and it held its own against the fighter its designer had spent his final working years racing to outmatch. Reginald Mitchell was not there to see any of it. He was not there when the first kill was confirmed over the Forth. He was not there when Fighter Command held the line through September 1940 and the threatened German invasion was quietly postponed. He was not there when the aircraft that carried his name began to be spoken of, even by pilots who had never met him, as the machine that had saved the country. What he left behind was not a finished victory, but an unfinished argument, a wing shaped by a decade of racing seaplanes, a philosophy that prized aerodynamic perfection over ease of manufacture, and a production crisis that very nearly proved his critics right before it proved them wrong. It had taken Joseph Smith, an unnamed workforce spread across a dispersed and improvised factory system, and a generation of young pilots who had never sat across a drafting table from Mitchell to turn his unfinished argument into an answer. The wing that had almost gotten the Spitfire canceled was, in the end, the same wing that helped win the battle for the skies over Britain, but it took every one of them, working without him, to close that distance in time. Supermarine had already been absorbed into the larger Vickers-Armstrongs group back in 1928, nearly a decade before Mitchell's death, but the company continued operating under its own name and its own identity throughout the war and into the post-war jet age. That identity did not survive the technological shift that followed. As Britain's aviation industry consolidated in the late 1950s, Vickers-Armstrong's aircraft operations, Supermarine included, were folded into the newly formed British Aircraft Corporation in 1960. The Supermarine name and the design offices at Hursley Park, where Mitchell's successors had once refined the Spitfire, quietly ceased to exist as an independent entity. Through subsequent decades of merger and consolidation, that lineage flows into what is today BAE Systems, one of the world's largest defense contractors, a corporate descendant so distant from a small Southampton seaplane works that almost nothing of Mitchell's original company survives in it beyond the historical record. The aircraft outlived the company by a wide margin. More than 20,000 Spitfires were built between 1938 and the end of production in the late 1940s, across dozens of variants that evolved far beyond anything Mitchell himself ever saw on a drafting table. Today, by most heritage aviation counts, somewhere in the range of 200 to nearly 300 Spitfires survive worldwide, in museums, private collections, and static displays from Britain to Australia to the United States. A smaller number, most estimates placing it somewhere between 50 and 80 aircraft, remain certified airworthy, still taking to the air at air shows nearly 90 years after Mitchell's prototype first left the ground at Eastleigh. Among them, aircraft with genuine Battle of Britain service history are treated as the rarest and most closely guarded of all, flown deliberately, sparingly, as much monuments as machines. The historical verdict on Mitchell's philosophy has never seriously been in dispute. The elliptical wing that nearly sank the production program in 1937 and 1938 is the same feature aviation historians point to, without exception, as the technical signature that made the Spitfire fly the way it did. The low drag shape, the forgiving stall, the turn performance that gave RAF pilots their edge in 1940. The production crisis was real, and it was Mitchell's own design choice that caused it. But it was a crisis of manufacturing, not of engineering, and history has judged the two very differently. Joseph Smith and the dispersed workforce who solved the production problem are remembered as the men who saved the program. Mitchell is remembered as the man who was right about what it would take to win, even though he did not live to see the argument settled in his favor. That is the peculiar shape of Mitchell's legacy. He is not remembered for founding a company that endures, the way some engineers are. Supermarine is gone, absorbed and reabsorbed until its name means nothing on a modern balance sheet. What endures instead is the aircraft itself, and the specific, stubborn idea that produced it, that the fastest way through the air is not the easiest way to build. Nearly 90 years later, that idea is still flying. Two men, two nations, two answers to the same question: what does a fighter need to be? Willy Messerschmitt built his answer around a factory floor. A wing that could be stamped, not shaped. A structure any skilled hand could learn in weeks, not years. His philosophy was volume, the conviction that a war in the air would be won by whichever side could put more machines in the sky, faster than the other. It was not a lesser philosophy. It was, for years, the winning one. Reginald Mitchell built his answer around a curve. A wing shaped the way water shapes a stone, smoothed until nothing remained but what the air itself demanded. His philosophy was subtraction, the conviction that a fighter's true strength lived not in how fast it could be built, but in how little it fought the sky once it was flying. It was a philosophy that nearly killed his own aircraft before it ever reached a squadron. It was also, when the moment came, the philosophy that let outnumbered pilots turn inside their attackers and live. The Bf 109 was built to be everywhere. The Spitfire was built to be better. In the summer of 1940, over the fields and coastline of southern England, that difference was tested directly, thousands of feet up, at 360 miles an hour, by young men who had no idea they were also testing two competing theories of engineering itself. Mitchell never saw that test. He designed the argument and died before he could hear the verdict. He watched his prototype fly once, in the spring of 1936, then spent his last year of life fighting a disease no wing shape could outmaneuver, working until there was nothing left to work with. He never wore a uniform. He never sat in a Spitfire's cockpit with an enemy in his sights. But somewhere over the Firth of Forth in October 1939, and again through the long summer of 1940, a curve he drew on a table years earlier reached out and did exactly what he built it to do. He did not live to see it fly in combat. It flew anyway.